Hello everyone, I'm Donna Williams and welcome to the second installment of Nobody Nowhere. So here we go. My father stopped existing when I was about 3, and up until then he, like my grandfather, intrigued me by calling things by special names. There was Cyril the Fox and Brookenstein Cat, Charlie Warmpton the Bed, and I was Polly the Possum, or Miss Polly. He'd actually called me this because I was echolalic until I was 4, repeating meaninglessly and echo everything I heard just like a parrot. My father catered to my fascination for small fancy things and shiny objects, and he'd bring me something different every week, and would always build me up by asking me if I knew how special and how magical these various bits and bobs were. I'd sit on his knee, my eye fastened to the object, listening to the story as though he was one of my storybook records. This is an original little long-playing record, and I am your storyteller. We are going to begin now to read the story of. I still have those treasures 23 years later. The he who he was deserted me, and when I found another he who I liked many years later, it took me years to make the connection that these two people were in fact the same person. My mother was as hard as I was gentle, and though strangely we shared the same distant, kind of unreachable nature. I had an older brother, and I think he became her only child. She'd wanted to put me in a children's home, and I recall being terrified and hysterical and kicking my feet against the car as she tried many times to force me in. I knew the terror of what else she could dish out, so being sent off to a children's home was, if that was the last resort, then surely this would mean insufferable torture comparable with hell on earth. Perhaps she wanted a daughter because she would dress my brother up as both the girl and the boy and take him out on alternate days for walks in the pram. We were both pretty children, but he could act normal, so it wasn't so embarrassing. I'm sure my father had thwarted her efforts by giving my grandparents responsibility for me. Perhaps, too, they tried to reach me and persisted beyond the point where her hope had run out. Nevertheless, my father paid the price for this, as did their relationship. He was ordered not to speak to me and to have nothing to do with me. When my mother spoke, the room shook. You listened, even if you didn't hear. Admittedly, my father was as insensitive and indifferent to her and my older brother as she was to me. And the family was split straight down the middle on this downward decline which spiraled before crashing headlong into the pits of hell. The names my parents called me exemplified this split. To my father, I was Polly. To my mother, I was Dolly, and in her own words, I learned who I was. You were the doll, and I was allowed to smash it. She told me over and over again, and it became a chain reaction. The tension would explode, and he'd degrade and abuse her, and then she would degrade and abuse me. Both of them had found forms of escape, which persisted on and off for many years, leaving in their wake more destructiveness than I could ever have conjured up in the magic of my insular little world. I never hugged either of them, and neither was I hugged. I didn't like people coming too close to me, let alone touching me. I felt that touch was pain, and I was frightened. My mother was a person who, although she had no friends to impress, she took pride in how her children looked. She'd brush my hair. I had this long, curly blonde hair, and she'd tear through it and its many knots with a vengeance. My Auntie Linda loved to brush my hair, but she'd do it so lightly that I'd find it annoying. Am I hurting you, she would say, as though some breakable china doll. Harder, I'd order. And though careful not to tear through the knots, she'd sit there brushing my hair for ages, as I would sit enjoying feeling it. You have fluffy, fairy hair, she'd say, so silky. Look at the way it fluffed out. And I'd like the words that she used, so I thought about the feel of things. For many years I'd played with, touched, and chewed my own hair. Touching other children's hair was the only friendly physical contact that I would make. The wisps surround me in my bed. They hover there to protect me. For the wisps, they are my friends. People were forever saying that I had no friends. In fact, my world was full of them. And they were far more magical, reliable, predictable, and real than other children. And they came with guarantees. It was a world of my own creation where I didn't need to control myself or the objects, animals, or nature, which was simply being in my presence. I had two other friends who did not belong to this physical world, the wisps and a pair of green eyes which hid under my bed named Willie. I was afraid to go to sleep, I always had been, so I'd sleep with my eyes open. And I did this for years. I guess I didn't appear to be terribly normal. Haunting or haunted would have been better adjectives. I was afraid of the dark, and though I loved the early dusk and dawn. My earliest memory of the wisps was when I began to sleep in a bed. Must have been in the new house that we lived in, although the old one had, in my mind, blended into this new one. It was as though there was now a series of rooms, and I could no longer find within the new house. This disturbed me, because I liked to know where everything was, including my parents. I had to know where everyone was and that they were all sleeping before I could dare to go to sleep. I'd lie in bed, stiff and silent, listening for an end to the muffled household sounds as I watched the transparent wisps hovering over me. The wisps were these tiny creatures, and they hung in the air directly above me. They looked something like wisps of hair, which is probably where my mind had found the idea. And they were almost transparent, though if you looked past them, there they were. They were very much there. Other than the wisps, my bed was surrounded and totally encased with these tiny spots, which I called stars, like some kind of mystical glass coffin. And I since learned they're actually air particles, which with hypersensitive vision I've been able to see. And they'd become the hypnotic foreground with which the rest of the world faded away. By looking through the stars and not at them, I could see them, and the rule was that I could not close my eyes or they'd leave me. And if they left me, they'd leave me unprotected against the intruders coming into my room. Feeling safe was a tiring business. And the intruders came in. They were responsible for taking away my protection, for the change of focus of those tiny spots would disappear, leaving me feeling angry and betrayed by my protection having left me alone, exposed, and vulnerable. I knew that people were disturbed at me sleeping with my eyes open, so I soon learned to close them when I heard them coming, to play dead, and never look at them or let them register when they lifted my eyelids or even poked me in the eye. I was breathing, so they knew I wasn't dead. The wisps left me by the time I had started proper school, though the stars around me as I slept, which are probably a later version of those spots, persisted on and off and sometimes still do. Willie was another story. Willie had begun at the same time as the wisps. I was probably about 2 years old, and unlike the wisps, he gave me no comfort, but he was a form of protection against the intruders in the night. He was no more than a pair of piercing green eyes, which was actually a nightlight plugged into a socket under the bed that had these two little green spots where the electric charge happened. And you could only see these little green eyes in the darkness. I was frightened of him, but so I thought were they, and so come hell or high water, I sided with Willie. As with anything I became close to, I'd try and lose myself within it, and I took to sleeping under the bed, and so I became Willie. By the time I was 3 years old, Willie had become the self that I directed at the outside world, complete with a hateful, glaring eyes, pinched up, rigid corpse-like stance, and clenched fists. Willie stabbed his foot. Willie spat. Willie, when he didn't like things. But that look of complete hatred was the worst weapon, and Donna paid the price. By now I was interacting with the outside world as Willie. The name was probably derived from my own surname, and some of the behaviour was probably modelled upon and in response to my own violator, my mother. Willie learned to use other people's phrases back at them in some sort of meaningful yet attacking way, though silence still seemed a far deadlier weapon. My mother began to think that I was evil and possessed, and it would have been easier to forgive her if she had suffered from hallucinations, but she didn't. Her lack of education and upbringing, her isolation and her drinking accounted for these beliefs more in terms of explanation than delusion.